In this tutorial, we'll learn how to use the Evaluate Dictionary Words plugin for the Butter text analysis software. What this plugin will do is allow us to take a Luke formatted dictionary and analyze a corpus of texts and then generate some of the properties of that dictionary. This is a really important step in dictionary development for word counting approaches to psychological text analysis. However, a lot of researchers don't engage in this process when they're creating and validating their dictionaries. Often when we're making a dictionary to measure something like positive emotion words or social processes or other content areas, what we want to know is, are there certain words that seem to really be driving our categories? Are there certain words that are more variable than others? What is the internal consistency of our categories, and so on? And that's what this plugin will allow us to do. It'll calculate a lot of those numbers for us. Now for this example, we'll look at a corpus I have of TED Talk transcripts. So these are just transcripts of TED Talks that were given over the years, and we'll use this to evaluate what our dictionaries look like. Now when you're doing this in your own work, you can use any type of text that you would like, and often what we would recommend is using a similar type of corpus that you would intend to use the dictionary on in regular use. So for example, if we were trying to evaluate how well a dictionary works or looks on something like Twitter data, we wouldn't necessarily want to use a really formal type of text like TED Talks or books or something like that. Now in this example, we'll also look at a couple of different dictionaries. So we'll look at the Body Types Dictionary, which was made in the 2000s, but it's based on much older work by Seymour Fisher and his colleagues, mostly in the 1960s. Very psychodynamic. This is not something that most psychologists would take very seriously today. And then we'll also look at a dictionary from some work by myself and my colleagues, which is designed to measure agency and communion. And we'll run these two dictionaries through the plugin and just see how they look at the end of the day. So what we want to do is we want to load up the text files. And we can see here that this plugin, it takes tokens as input. So we'll want to first tokenize our texts. And before we add the Evaluate Words plugin, we'll also want to set some kind of a floor threshold for how short text can be before we put them in here. So if we're calculating things like internal consistency, using something like a Cronbach's alpha metric or one of the other variations, we don't want to have really, really short text because there's not enough space, there's not enough opportunity for different words that are measuring or tapping into the same construct to co-occur in the first place. And so if we have some texts, and I know the TED Talk corpus does, if we have some texts that are very short, less than 10 words, less than 25 words, for example, we'll want to make sure those are left out. So we'll use this plugin to make sure that that happens before we evaluate the corpus. And in this case, let's be a little conservative. Let's say we want 100 words minimum for our evaluation. Now we have the texts. They're getting tokenized and being passed into and then filtered out of the Omit Observations plugin. Now we can evaluate our dictionary words. So we'll add this plugin. And there are a few different options here, and we'll walk through these each in turn. So we want to choose which dictionary we want to evaluate, and these should be formatted in the same way that you would format a dictionary for use with Luke. So we'll do the Agency and Communion Dictionary first. Now these options here are optional. They just really depend on what it is you're most interested in. So if you don't care about individual standard deviations of words, you can uncheck this box here, and we'll see what that looks like when we get the output. I'm going to go ahead and leave this checked, but whether you do or not is totally up to you. This box here also asks us whether we want to calculate the internal consistency metrics and get all of the output based on raw word frequencies. So for example, in the Agency Communion Dictionary, we're going to count how many times each of these words appears in each text. This option lets us decide if we want to calculate the numbers based on the raw occurrences of each word. Does this word achieve, achievement, and so on? Does this occur 10 times, or do we want to do it based on percentages, which is the default? So what percentage of each text is comprised of this token, or token with wildcard? Now traditionally we would leave this box unchecked, but you can try it both ways and see which one makes most sense given your research, your dictionary design, and your research questions. This last option here, round all values to n decimals. This really just depends on how clean you want your output from this plugin to be. So I think this can go up to maybe 10 or 15, something in that ballpark, but often we don't really care about means going out to that far. In this case, if you are working with really rare or uncommon words, however, you may want to turn this value up considerably so that they don't get rounded off to 0. So if you have a word that occurs 1 or 2 times out of texts that are on average hundreds of thousands of words long, you'll want to turn this value up so that it doesn't look like the word never occurs. From there then, we can choose our output plugin and choose where we want to save that output. And I'll just name this one Agency and Communion. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and do the same thing with the body type dictionary. So I just copied and pasted this little subtree right here, and we'll go ahead and set this up so that we're loading in the body type dictionary output. Or, I'm sorry, body type dictionary that will evaluate. And we'll just name the output of this one body type. So I think we're all set up here. We'll go ahead and click Begin Analysis, and we'll be back once it's done. And it looks like we're just about done here. We're almost at 99%. So in just a second, this will finish up and we'll have our results. Success. So let's see what Butter gave us. So let's go ahead and look at the body type dictionary output first. Now there are a few things going on here. So we can see across the very top, these are the different dictionary categories. So the columns correspond to each of the categories, and as you can see here, starting around the 4th row, we have all of the different terms or words that go into the dictionary. Now these first couple of rows here, we have a Cronbach's Alpha score and the KR20 formula score. Now, these are both measures of internal reliability. What you'll often see reported as Cronbach's Alpha is pretty standard for internal consistency metrics. Some people use it for test-retest reliability and so on. And you notice that these scores are a lot lower than the KR20 formula scores. This is also pretty normal and pretty expected. And we'll also note that these scores here for Cronbach's Alpha, these are very low compared to what you'd expect to see for a traditional psychometric approach. So if you had a self-report questionnaire where one of the facets or subscales had a Cronbach's Alpha value of 0.23, 0.16, something like that, you would throw it away and set it on fire. But that's not what we do with language data, because the properties of language data, the distributions, the ways in which words are interrelated, are very different than what you'd see in a typical self-report questionnaire, for example. This is why often you'll see people report what is essentially the KR20 scores, although they'll usually still call it a Cronbach's alpha score. They'll call it Cronbach's alpha, but maybe say it's on binary data or one-hot encoded data or something like that. They're roughly the same. The difference is what numbers from our texts go into the same formula. For the most part, you don't need to worry about this too much, and generally speaking, I would recommend focusing on the KR20 scores as a better approximation of the internal consistency of each of your categories. Now that said, you notice for this dictionary, these are all still fairly low. Most of these don't break above 0.5, which is what most people would recommend as a bare minimum acceptable standard. And a lot of these are very, very low. Now what this essentially means is that most of these categories probably are not very valid from a psychometric perspective. Chances are the words that are going into, say, the transparency category aren't really all capturing the same underlying construct. Now what we can do, let's go ahead and delete these rows here, and let's look at the actual words that go into each category. So let's sort, say, the penetration total category, and we can see that which of these words are the strongest contributor to the overall scores or the overall values of this category. So we can see that words like disease, cancer, and arch, with an asterisk at the end there, wild card, are the three largest contributors here. Now what about the barrier category? So here we can see that the words that are contributing the most to it are book, behind, wall, cove, and so on. Questionable from a validity standpoint. You can think that maybe, according to the theories that they had and were building on, words like wall and cove and maybe hide would be relevant to barrier language and how people think about their bodies in terms of accessibility and so on. But for the most part, you probably would not trust this using modern empirical scientific criteria. And we can see for each of these words, we have both the mean and then parentheses is the standard deviation. So we can get a sense not only of how much each word contributes to the overall average across the entire TED Talk corpus, but what the variability of each word is across each text. And if we were to take the means for all of the words for each category and add them up, that would be the mean for the entire data set. Let's look at the agency and communion dictionary and see if it did any better. And it did much, much better. So here we can see that not only are the Cronbach's alpha scores considerably higher, but the KR20 scores are much, much closer and actually well above the threshold that we'd say is acceptable for internal consistency. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that these categories are inherently valid, that the way that these dictionaries are structured are necessarily measuring what we think they're measuring. But what it does tell us is that when we consider all of the words together, they seem to be converging on some kind of a similar construct. And we can sort here and see which words are the strongest contributors to each of these categories. So we have words like you, do, know, think, your. You and your might seem a little unintuitive, but these come from work on function words that suggest that an external social focus has to do with agency and one's confidence and abilities and social status and so on. Other words seem to be a bit more face valid. Words like do and know and think tie into the theory of agency as a striving for mastery and competence and so on. Let's look at the communion category. We, us, our, talk, kind, thank, human. Again, fairly face valid. We see the means here actually fairly good when it comes to word counting approaches. So we can conclude, at the very least, that the internal consistencies are much, much better for the agency and communion dictionary, and additionally, that the body type dictionary is probably not valid for empirical use in a scientific setting. And that's it. That's how we use the Evaluate Dictionary Words plugin for the Butter text analysis software.